This lecture will explore how the Second World War transformed the geopolitical landscape in East Central Europe and examine Ukraine's role in this new order. The Soviet Union's victory in the Second World War made it a global superpower and altered the balance of power in Europe. At the Yalta Conference, Stalin was determining European borders. East Central Europe became a buffer zone for the USSR, with Ukraine as a crucial defensive outpost. However, securing the loyalty of the Ukrainian population remained a significant challenge. To implement his vision, Stalin needed to, first, suppress potentially disloyal groups in Soviet Ukraine. Second, resolve Western border issues with Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania. Third, create an ethnically homogeneous buffer along the USSR's southwestern border by replacing the national minorities traditionally living in the borderlands with primarily Russians or other Slavic populations of the Soviet Union. Fourth, establish a security zone in Central Europe. While Nazi occupiers were expelled from Ukraine on October 28, 1944, liberation remained elusive as the Soviet repressive regime returned. Stalin was suspicious towards all people who had lived under Nazi occupation, particularly Ukrainians in Galicia and Volhynia. In these regions, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUN, and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, fiercely resisted re-Sovietization. The OUN and UPA leadership hoped that Nazi Germany's surrender would trigger a new conflict between the USSR and the West, potentially enabling Ukrainian independence. Instead, mutual exhaustion led to the Cold War. By 1944, the UPA found itself operating deep within Soviet territory. They continued resistance against Soviet authority, which sought to eliminate the insurgent movement in Western Ukraine. However, the UPA faced increasingly difficult circumstances. The movement suffered a significant setback during the Great Blockade of January to April 1946. Over 229,000 NKVD troops were mobilized to seal off Galicia and Volhynia, where the main UPA forces were operating. The blockade aimed to destroy the resistance and reduce the number of insurgents. The UPA bore significant losses, with its numbers halving from 20 to 25,000 to 10 to 12,000 fighters. This was a major strategic defeat for the UPA, although the struggle continued for many years afterwards. The Soviet regime targeted families of insurgents through collective punishment, responding to the OUN and UPA's substantial local support. On May 24, 1947, the Soviet leadership decided to carry out another deportation, Operation West. It began on October 21, 1947. This operation covered many towns and villages in Rivne, Lviv, Volhynia, Ternopil, Ivano-Frankivsk, and Chernivtsi regions. By October 26, 77,808 people, or 26,682 families, were deported from Western Ukraine to Kazakhstan and Siberia. Over 60,000 were forced to work in coal mining. Soviet authorities offered amnesties to weaken the OUN and UPA resistance. Between 1945 and 1949, 7 amnesties were announced for underground participants. Over 100,000 people accepted them. But many faced new repressions. They were either arrested or forcibly sent to work, casting doubt on the sincerity of Soviet promises. In 1949, the UPA leadership disbanded its units and switched to underground struggle due to losses and increased pressure from Soviet forces. This marked the beginning of the decline in active insurgent combat operations in Western Ukraine. Still, the last actions of the Ukrainian resistance movement were recorded as late as the early 1960s. From 1944 to 1953, over 210,000 Western Ukrainian residents were deported to Siberia, the Far East, and Central Asia. They included the families of OUN members, the UPA fighters, wealthy peasants, Greek Catholic priests who refused to convert to Orthodoxy, and Jehovah's Witnesses. Ukrainian resistance continued, even in Soviet concentration camps. In 1953, former UPA fighters led the Norilsk uprising, one of the largest Gulag protests. It was brutally suppressed. The following year, Ukrainians organized the 2-month Kengir uprising, demanding improved conditions, amnesty, and an end to repression. Thus, Ukrainians contributed to the Gulag system's dissolution in 1956. Stalin suspected entire nations of disloyalty. Jewish communities, barely recovered from the Holocaust, faced Stalin's anti-Semitic campaigns launched in 1946. The campaign culminated in the 1948 murder of Solomon Michels, leader of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, or the JAC. On November 20th, 1948, the Politburo dissolved the JAC, declaring it a center of anti-Soviet propaganda. This case led to 110 arrests. In 1952, 13 of the arrested, including prominent writers and poets, were sentenced to death and executed. Some of them were from Ukraine. What was the supposed guilt of Soviet Jews? Stalin perceived Israel's creation as a threat and suspected Soviet Jews of so-called Zionism. JAC members supported Israel's creation, but didn't encourage Jews to leave the USSR. In 1944, the JAC approached the Soviet leadership, proposing support for Jewish autonomy in Crimea. However, Stalin had already begun implementing an extensive plan to create an ethnically homogeneous buffer along the Soviet Union's southwestern borders. The deportation of Crimean Tatars and their replacement with Russians was only the beginning. According to Stalin, any national minority was potentially disloyal and suspicious. Jews were no exception. Stalin launched a campaign against, quote, Jewish bourgeois nationalists. It included the 1952 Doctors' Plot, when Jewish physicians were accused of plotting against Soviet leaders. This was meant to form the basis for mass repressions. Stalin's death in 1953 saved Soviet Jews from greater persecution. Creating an ethnically homogeneous zone along the USSR's southwestern border coincided with post-war settlements in East Central Europe. Ukraine's role remained largely symbolic. On February 5, 1944, the Soviet leadership established the People's Commissariat for Foreign Affairs of the Ukrainian SSR. This decision was part of Stalin's propaganda to strengthen the USSR's international influence and secure additional votes in the UN. While Ukraine formally became a subject of international law, it had no real independence. From July 17th to August 2nd, 1945, representatives of the USSR, USA, and Great Britain met in Potsdam, near Berlin. They discussed Germany's disarmament, demilitarization, and democratization. They also created the Council of Foreign Ministers to prepare peace treaties with Germany's former allies. The conference approved transferring territories up to the Oder and Neisse rivers to Poland, while East Prussia was divided between the USSR and Poland. Though Soviet authorities promised free elections, they established communist regimes in East Central European countries. On April 21, 1945, the USSR and Poland signed a treaty of friendship, mutual assistance, and post-war cooperation. On August 16th, a Soviet-Polish border treaty was concluded. According to the Yalta Conference decision, the border followed the Curzon line, with some deviations favoring Poland. Stalin aimed to make Poland a controlled ally rather than a hostile state. The new border left large Ukrainian and Polish communities outside their respective countries. To resolve this, the Ukrainian SSR government and the Polish Committee of National Liberation, representing Poland's pro-Soviet government, signed the Lublin Agreement on mutual population evacuation on September 9, 1944. About 110,000 Poles relocated to Poland, and approximately 482,000 Ukrainians moved to the Ukrainian SSR. Of these, 82,000 Ukrainians moved voluntarily, 300,000 were forcibly deported, and 100,000 lost their homes and had to leave their lands. In April 1947, the Polish government conducted Operation Vistula, relocating 150,000 Ukrainians from the Lemko region to the northwestern areas of Poland. Ukrainians were dispersed to promote their rapid assimilation, with a few families per village. On December 12, 1943, the USSR and Czechoslovakia signed a treaty of friendship and cooperation, which became the basis for post-war borders. On June 29, 1945, in Moscow, a Czechoslovak delegation signed a treaty on the accession of Transcarpathian Ukraine to the Ukrainian SSR, based on, quote, the desire of the population. The treaty also created a commission to demarcate the borders and establish rules for the population exchange. Ukrainians and Russians living in Czechoslovakia could obtain Soviet citizenship, while Slovaks and Czechs living in Transcarpathian Ukraine could acquire Czechoslovak citizenship. In November 1945, both countries ratified the treaty. On January 22, 1946, Transcarpathia officially became part of the Ukrainian SSR. In December 1945, the foreign ministers of the USSR, the United States, and Great Britain met in Moscow. They agreed to prepare peace treaties with countries that supported Nazi Germany, including Romania and Hungary. These countries were allowed armies for defense, but the Soviet Union reserved the right to station its troops in Romania and Hungary to keep in touch with forces in Austria. As a gesture of goodwill, the Kremlin decided not to demand reparations from these countries. The post-war border settlement involved large-scale deportations and exchanges of population, which had signs of ethnic cleansing. About 12 to 14 million Germans were evicted from Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and other Eastern European countries. Stalin played a key role in creating ethnically homogeneous territories along the USSR's western border and providing an external security belt of satellite states. Communist regimes were established in these states with the support of the Soviet Army. In 1955, these countries joined the Warsaw Pact as a counterweight to NATO. The world order created by the winners of the Second World War was based on bilateral agreements and the UN Charter. Despite numerous challenges, such as the 1961 nuclear crisis, this order remained relatively stable for almost 8 decades. However, in 2014, Russia's aggression against Ukraine and occupation of part of Ukrainian territory violated the basic principle of the UN Charter, the inviolability of international borders. The weak response of the international community intensified the Kremlin's anti-Ukrainian policy. The full-scale invasion on February 24, 2022, finally destroyed the post-war security system, opening a new era in world politics.